Thank you very much, Dr. Madanipur. Well, the title of my presentation this morning is Urban Planning in Ancient and Medieval Iran. Hopefully we'll get the PowerPoint sorted out in a moment, but I'll start off anyway. Large urban agglomerations came into being in around 3000 BC, or a little before, as a result of developing economies, the introduction of writing, and improved trade networks and patterns of distribution. These large urban sites are sometimes called megacities, but a megacity is usually defined as a metropolitan area with a total population in excess of 10 million people. We're not talking about cities that are that big. Well, in Iran, major settlements at this date include Susa, Choga Mish, Tali Malian, Tapi Sial, Tapi Hessa, Shahdad, Shari Sokhter, and Tapi Yahya. But in most of these cities, the amount of excavation in the settlements of this date, which are often buried deep beneath layers of later occupation, has been strictly limited, so that extensive or meaningful plans of the cities of this date are not usually available. So in these circumstances, it's difficult to make any significant comments about urban planning or the lack of it. An exception here is Choga Mish in southwest Iran, in Khuzestan, which was in fact a substantial settlement with a size of about 11 hectares from around 4000 BC onwards, when incidentally there was no occupation at all at the great nearby site of Susa. And it's clear from the excavation report by Abbas Alizadeh that at the end of the 4th millennium BC, that's around about 3100 BC, Choga Mish was a planned township with streets and alleys, sewers and irrigation drains, water wells and even cesspools. And it contained workshops, public and private buildings. And it's very interesting that the public and private buildings were constructed of ordinary mud brick, unbaked, whereas the pavements, drains, wells and cesspools were all built with baked bricks. But generally, one is left with the impression that settlements grew in an uncontrolled fashion. As with all cities in the ancient Near East, the bazaar area, or the artisans area, is likely to have been an important element in the city, surrounded by densely packed private housing and a few public buildings, such as temples or sometimes the residence or the king of the ruler. They may also serve, these palaces, as administrative buildings. And the sort of pattern that may be typical for much of the region can be seen at Ur in Mesopotamia, where in excavations between 1932 and 1934, Sir Leonard Woolley uncovered an area of densely packed private housing dating from the early 2nd millennium BC, from about 1750 BC. And as you can see from this plan, the houses are crammed together, separated by narrow alleys. But I have to say that in contrast to this view, in an important article published in 1974, Dr. Bobo suggested that from ancient times, the central feature of many Iranian cities was a central square, which probably acted both as a central open market and a place for social gatherings. And he wrote, and I quote Dr. Bobo, "The outer limits and the centres of the old Iranian cities were always well defined. The outer limits consisted of fortifications, and the centre was marked either by a fortress or an open square with the major buildings situated around it." Where the focal point of the city was the square, that square usually contained, now this is in a slightly later period of course, the Friday mosque, the bazaar and the palace of the king or the governor's residence. Other features would have included a caravanserai, bathhouse, hostel and so on. This model may be true for the Parthian, Sasanian and early Islamic periods, but I suspect that evidence for such an arrangement in earlier periods is lacking. Perhaps this is something we might come back to and discuss in due course, Dr. Borba. Well, perhaps the first proper evidence for large-scale city planning in Iran is at Choga Zanbil, the city in Khuzestan founded by Untash Naparisha in about 1250 BC. And here, a fortified wall encloses an area of about 100 hectares for quite a big settlement, inside which is this large and very well preserved ziggurat. In fact, the best preserved ziggurat in the whole of the Middle East, and also a royal quarter. You can see from the plan that the ziggurat is separated from the outer town by two successive enclosure walls, and within the ziggurat compound are four temples dedicated to different Elamite gods. And to the east of the ziggurat enclosure was the royal quarter with palaces and another temple. And many of the buildings and spaces here at Choga Zanbil were elaborately decorated with glazed wall plaques, glass rods, faience statues of animals and so on. But such settlements on previously unoccupied or pristine land are really quite exceptional. An example some of you may be familiar with in neighbouring Mesopotamia would be the Assyrian site of Firuzabad, founded by Sargon at the end of the 8th century BC. In western Iran at this date, settlements are usually much smaller than Choga Zanbil or Firuzabad, and they're usually surrounded by fortification walls. The best known example of an Iron Age site of this date is Hasanlu in Azerbaijan, probably a major centre of an Indo-Iranian people known as the Manians. The Hasanlu 4B settlement, this in technical terms is Iron Age 2 period, was destroyed by a fierce fire in about 800 BC or later, and excavations by the University of Pennsylvania between 1956 and 74 have revealed a series of columned buildings, probably the precursors of the later Achaemenid columned halls. And these columned buildings are arranged around central courtyards, an important point. Although well preserved, the plan of this level is far from complete, and we've got little information at Hasanlu about residential areas, industrial areas, and market areas. Another Iranian group, the Medes, were well established in western Iran from around the 9th century BC onwards, and they were a constant thorn in the side of the powerful Assyrian state to the west. Although they've been dismissed by some revisionist historians as little more than a loose coalition of tribes, they were sufficiently powerful for the Assyrian king Isfahan to get them to sign what are known as vassal treaties, guaranteeing to safeguard the accession to the Assyrian throne. Although very few Median sites have been excavated, we are fortunate that a number of their fortresses are depicted on Assyrian reliefs, particularly in the reign of Sargon in the 8th century. And these show large cities with formidable fortifications, which testify to a high degree of architectural organization and planning. Now, it's sometimes argued that for propaganda purposes, the Assyrians deliberately exaggerated the strength and capacity of their opponents, but to my mind there's no reason to doubt the veracity of these representations. What may be in doubt, I think, is our ability to read them correctly. The only Median site to have been excavated fully so far is Tape Nushijan near Malayo, but this is a very atypical site and little can be deduced from the plan. You can see here that there is at Nushijan a building on a different orientation on the left called the Old Western Building, and then a cluster of buildings around a fire temple in the centre, a columned hall on the left, and a fortified storeroom on the right. But the purpose of this cluster of buildings, I think, is clearly religious. It's known from textual sources that the main Median centre was at Hamadan. I've come forward a bit, this is not Hamadan yet. But frustratingly, the site of the ancient city has not been identified. It's often assumed to have been on the Ekbatana mound in Hamadan, but extensive excavations here by the Iranian Cultural Heritage Organization have revealed no traces of the ancient Median city, which must have been somewhere else in Hamadan. But fortunately, the Greek author Herodotus has left us a detailed description of the city. He writes, "This fortress is so planned that each circle of walls is higher than the next circle, and the site being on a hill in the plain, it says the beauty of the site was chiefly accomplished by art. There are 7 circles in all. The longest wall is about the length of the wall that surrounds Athens. The battlements of the first circle are white, of the second black, of the third purple, of the fourth blue, and of the fourth orange," which must have produced some kind of multicoloured effect, if that was true. And the battlements of the 5 circles are painted in this way with colours, and the battlements of the last 2 circles are coated with silver and gold. Well, whether this is an accurate description, of course, we can't know, but obviously the ancient city of Hamadan was a formidable and presumably carefully planned fortress, with the main royal and administrative buildings enclosed within the walls. And Hamadan may even have been a model for the Achaemenid cities that succeeded it. Well, as is well known, the Achaemenid or Persian period begins in 550 BC, when Cyrus the Great established himself as the undisputed king of the Medes and the Persians. In terms of building projects, he's mostly associated with the city of Pasargadae in Fars. And it's immediately obvious that the layout and design of Pasargadae were carefully planned. In the middle of what are apparently extensive gardens, Cyrus built a gatehouse and 2 small palaces with columned halls. Those are the 2 palaces you can see on the screen there. Several pavilions and a curious stone structure, probably with a religious purpose, called the Zendani Soliman. Excavations by David Stronach of Pasargadae have revealed stone-lined water channels dividing the garden into 4 segments, anticipating the classic Persian garden design known as the Char Bagh. It used to be thought that there were few, if any, other buildings at Pasargadae, but investigation by ground-penetrating radar by the French Archaeological Institute in Iran, directed by Dr. Remy Bouchala, have revealed a more complex picture, and the publication of this work is eagerly awaited. Here are some reconstructions of the gardens at Pasargadae in the wonderful series of DVD volumes produced by Mr. Razayan. He's done volumes on Persepolis, Pasargadae, and a number of other sites in Iran. Well, a large stone platform on the northeast side of the site at Pasargadae is constructed around a rocky outcrop known as the Talitakt, which I think is probably a forerunner of the platform at Persepolis, and was no doubt intended as the site for a series of splendid palatial buildings. But this scheme was probably abandoned when the focus moved to Persepolis. There are actually some remains of buildings on the Talitakt, but they're all post-Achaemenid in date. Well, it goes without saying that Persepolis, or Takhti Jamshid, is one of the best examples of city planning in the ancient world, because the buildings on the platform are so well preserved. They're arranged on a raised terrace measuring about 450 by 300 meters, and most, but not all of the buildings were constructed during the reigns of Darius and Xerxes. And access to the complex is via a monumental staircase and two gatehouses, and on the terrace there's a mixture of reception halls, administrative buildings, and palaces that may have been in part residential. And of particular note at Persepolis are the Apadana of Xerxes, the Hall of 100 Columns, and the treasury. And the Apadana palace, which you could see centre left, is an excellent example of a Persian columned hall, with a central columned hall surrounded on three sides by porticos and with four corner towers. And I should say that a remarkable feature of Persepolis is that there's a complex system of underground conduits and drains beneath the platform for the disposal of wastewater and sewage. And some of these tunnels are apparently several meters in height, but I haven't had an opportunity to investigate them myself. There are in fact excavations of this subterranean water disposal system ongoing at the moment. It'll be interesting to see the final results, but presumably that whole arrangement was an integral feature of the original master plan. It used to be thought that the buildings at Persepolis were mostly restricted to the platform, and that seasonal residents lived in temporary accommodation such as tents, but it's now clear there was an extensive network of buildings on the plain below and around the platform. And recent excavation work has revealed not only a series of buildings, but has produced evidence that the building program at Persepolis was actually initiated by Cyrus and not by Darius, as previously thought. Recent excavations by Professor Pier Francesco Cagliari of the University of Bologna has shown us that there was on the plain at Persepolis a replica of the Ishtar Gate at Babylon, complete with glazed bricks showing lions, dragon figures, and bulls. This is the Ishtar Gate in the Museum at Berlin, the Ishtar Gate from Babylon. And it's now clear that a replica gate of this kind was also constructed at Persepolis. And it has to be concluded that after his capture of Babylon in 539, Cyrus brought to Persia Babylonian craftsmen in order to build this monument. The situation at the other great Achaemenid site of Susa is somewhat complicated in that Susa was constructed on the top of an earlier settlement, but what we can see at Susa is the construction of this huge palace of Darius and three gates there, one called the Artisan's Gate, the Propylaeum, and the Gate of Darius, which must have formed some kind of processional route through to the palace itself. An important addition to these monumental palaces and buildings in the Persian period was gardens, and often these gardens must have contained small columned halls, or apadanas as they're sometimes wrongly called. And this is as an example of one that's been found recently in an outlying part of the Persian Empire, actually at Sidon in the Lebanon. Now, in the subsequent Hellenistic period, beginning with Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire, we've got the introduction of a new type of urban plan, the so-called Hippodamian plan, named after Hippodamus of Miletus, which is characterized by streets crisscrossing at right angles and dividing the city into a series of regular grids. The best example of this system is at Piraeus, the port of Athens, but there are other good instances of this at places like Halicarnassus, Alexandria, and Seleucia on the Tigris. A number of cities in Iran that were founded in the Hellenistic period, such as Susa and Hamadan, no doubt had plans of this kind. From the succeeding Parthian period, there are substantial city remains at Nisa and Merv in Turkmenistan, at Shari Kumis and Ray in Iran, and at Hatra and Asher in Iraq. And the tradition of the round city, which we'll come to in a moment I promise, is first attested in the Parthian period, for example at Hatra. Hatra. This is the example that's on the screen now. And this is a tradition that continues in Sasanian times, and there are particularly good examples of Sasanian round cities at Firuzabad and Darabgird. And in each case, the cities have a focal point in the centre of the circle, surrounded by a carefully laid out urban plan. And the cities were not simply round for defensive reasons is clear, because at Firuzabad, Ardashir built his palace outside the circular city. But in more remote parts of the Sasanian Empire, like Haftavantapi in Iranian Azerbaijan, the circular wall around the top of the mound is definitely defensive. I just conclude by saying that many cities in the Islamic period are founded on Sasanian or early settlements. For example, the sacred site of Takhti Suleiman, where there was a fire temple, was reoccupied in the Ilkhanid period. And at sites like Istah, Ray, Kashan and Nishapur, there was more or less continuous occupation from the Sasanian period onwards, and so the opportunities for unrestricted development were limited. But there are occasional examples of cities being laid out to a preconceived plan. The best example of this phenomenon is, of course, Isfahan, refounded by Shah Abbas in 1598. It's not my intention in this short paper to review town planning in the Islamic period, but in relation to Isfahan, it may be pointed out, it's been argued that the whole city conforms to a charbagh design, with the city divided into 4 quarters by the intersecting Charbagh Avenue on a vertical axis and the river Zayandi Road on a horizontal axis. The 4 resulting districts of the city are named Royal, New Julfa, Abbasabad and Gabrion. It may thus be claimed that Isfahan was the first garden city. Thank you very much.